After a good few years, Nvidia's GTX 980 Ti is finally in bargain bin territory. The question today is it good value, or is it completely obsolete? Right, so this here is my new GTX 980 Ti that I got for quite cheap off eBay. I'll throw up the price. It was around £40. And with prices going up through the roof on things like GTX 1060s, RX 480 and RX 580s, these older AMD and Nvidia cards are becoming more sought after in comparison as cheaper alternatives. And the 980 Ti was a powerful card, so this seems like a lot of power, but the listing wasn't particularly fantastic. Admittedly, the seller was. The seller has kept me updated every stage of the way with where this is and where it'll be arriving. It was used until 3 years ago, and it was put in a box, and now they're just getting rid of it. They don't want it anymore, so it may or may not work. Hopefully, it does. So let's get this open and see if it's survived. Well, it's in here somewhere. It's probably taken a bit of a beating because there is a rip in the packaging, I've just noticed. It is a 980 Ti. I've always wanted to own one of these just because of how good they were back in the day, and I don't doubt they're still good today even. I mean, it doesn't look damaged, I say, until I notice the giant dent that may or may not be from, well, I think that's probably from shipping, to be fair. But yeah, it looks like it's just based on the reference design, but with this funky cooler. These are the cheaper versions available, are the blower designs, but it is a 6GB model, which, I mean, 40 quid for one of these is good. I think they're about 80 to 90 pounds over on CEX. Never been opened. It's still got the MSI seal on it. At least inspires me with a bit of hope. It has the old storage cover. I've already got a PC set up, so we haven't got anything to worry about there. But I genuinely do believe these could be a good way into the world of PC gaming, as long as you're not fussed about RTX. You can pick them up for good prices at the moment. No one's really got to the 980 Ti's, and we've seen how well the Maxwell Architecture's been doing with things like the GTX 750 and the 750 Ti recently. So top-end Maxwell should be, well, it should be doing fine. What do you actually need to power it? You need an 8-pin and a 6-pin, so we will be doing power consumption tests. Given how many similarities, though, that Maxwell has with Pascal, which is still used so heavily, it should be okay. Right, let's see if we get a display out of it, though. It's on. Okay, that does work. It would have been cool to get a reference model, but honestly, when we're paying this little for the graphics card, I'm not entirely too fussed. What I will go ahead and do is check the date of the latest drivers. I want to say Maxwell is still on bug fixes and support, so it should have drivers from this year. Let's just double check. I've always wanted one of these. It's sort of the era that I always wanted a high-end PC, ended up with a HD 7770 because it was all I could afford. This was the card I remember being the one to have. And we've got drivers dated January 28, 2026, which means they're on quarterly fixes, I believe. I'm just going to double check though, what is the going rate for one of these on CEX? Because I'm fairly sure the 6GB was the higher VRAM version. I was misremembering a little bit, but they're around £75 on CEX. So given what I paid, this seems to be remarkably good value. But I've been seeing lots of these sell really cheap over on eBay. At the same time, if it is as good as I think it is, £75 is not actually a terrible price. I mean, don't get me wrong, you could get a newer graphics card for this price, but still not terrible, and you can pick them up a lot cheaper than this, as we've just seen, if this actually does install drivers and does actually work. I'm not entirely filled with confidence that it's defaulted to 640 by 480 in stretched widescreen, so I am just going to run DDU and double check. Are you going to Artifact and die? No, you're fine. Card does seem to work for now. I will launch up 3D Mark, and I think we get a baseline score, because I actually have no clue how to place the 980 Ti, because I've not been able to afford one till this point, because it's only now that seemingly everyone's after the Pascal and Polaris cards that everyone is forgetting these exist, and they have just plummeted down to the lowest point I've ever seen them. And these were very powerful on a good architecture that supports a lot of APIs and is really quite solid. So let's see what it actually does. So I'm trying to think off the top of my head, what kind of competition does this really have? Because I would say the AMD Vega cards, but at the same time, it's mostly up against things like the 1060, 580, 480, 590, that sort of range of cards have now moved up a bit this year, given the prices on everything, making the competition to this pretty much the next generation's mid-range, rather than this being a high-end card. let's take a little look. I do want to run this through TimeSpy to get a baseline reading for a couple of reasons. One, I have no idea how they perform. Two, I have no idea what thermals are going to be like, given this genuinely is running the original thermal paste and still has the original seals on it. We may need to change that. Okay, the card is running hot already. It's already up to the mid-70s. Okay, it's nearly up to 80 degrees. The frame rate, that is a great frame rate for TimeSpy on a cheap card. Now the fan has kicked in a little bit. This isn't too bad. We'll check at the end to see what the boost clocks are doing and see if it is running okay. I suppose it is an 11-year-old card. That is going to be 11-year-old thermal paste. How are we looking? 4,779 out of the box. Is beneath the average. This thing is throttling quite hard. I do think there's another 1,000 points missing here because of thermal. So let's take this out, give it a clean, and see just how bad things are. Here's the one thing with these. The cheap ones usually are the blower designs. Oh, I sure do love screws. No, there's more. Nope, there's still more. Alright, let's see. It's pretty dry, it's pretty flaky. It's just coming off in chunks. Yeah, I'm just going to get this cleaned up, thrown back together, and then we will try and benchmark it again and see if it's any better, because I think it is just... it's got old thermal paste. Right, so I have gone through and cleaned up the 980 Ti. It's running fresh thermal paste, all the dust is gone, it's looking rather clean. Some of the plastic coating on the other side did come off. I'm guessing it's just where it is now 11 years old. It probably got knocked about, there was a couple of scratches, and going over it with the cloth didn't help. We now need to see if this has helped performance. But I suppose if you are someone looking at 980 Ti's, this is definitely a point of contention. You are going to be looking on the lower end of the market at these blower coolers. Whether or not they've ever been serviced or cleaned before is, you know, going to be a mystery. And to be fair, I didn't film putting it back together because getting the thing apart has so many screws. But I've gone through, I've done a full refurb underneath, nothing too impressive, but enough to at least bring thermals down. And we are now going to find out just what kind of difference it has made. Thermals aren't shooting up as quickly as they were before. No, it is definitely doing better. It's peaking out around 83 degrees now, rather than getting to just below 90. So, yeah, it does seem a tad happier. Was our card just dirty? 5,506? Yeah, we've gained about 500 points just from cleaning it. Why don't we see if this thing will budge with a bit of an overclock? I know that with BIOS tweaks and bits and pieces like that, you can get some serious extra power out of a 980 Ti. Let's be honest, if you're buying the cheap ones, I'm sure some of you out there have got better bargains than this, but most of the ones I'm seeing going cheap look like this one. If we'd go higher on the core, 265. No, okay, we found our limit. We can about 250 on the core, apparently 500 megahertz on the memory. We'll see how stable that is. Oh, that is very hot. Yeah, I don't think you should probably be overclocking like this on one of these. Right, what one is a good one? That one there is fine. Okay, we do look like we've gained a substantial chunk of performance. Something tells me, though, this is just going to bring it up to the average. It's actually not running crazy hot. We'll see what it tops out at. I do think it is going to be around 85 to 90 degrees, given the... I mean, it's a blower cooler. It has a fan on it. Okay, yeah. You can tweak these and get proper performance out of them even on the blower cooler. So we are now above the average, 6,611. That's sort of around where I'd expect it to be. It's not the best, but it's better than the average. Let's try again, shall we? Let's just see how it'll run just something. Yeah, I think it's still got all the tweaks that I applied from last week, because this is running with everything turned off, so we're getting like 80-ish FPS. Right, just because that was a little bit unfair here, Cyberpunk has now relaunched with the high preset. There's no scaling, there's nothing like that going on, it's just the game set to its high settings in 1080p, no FSR, nothing like that. Definitely no config file in place because that is what was causing the crashing, and this is running perfectly. We're getting anywhere from sort of 30 to 50 FPS in places, and this is during actual gameplay on what is a graphics card I paid about 40 quid for. So yeah, I'm not exactly worried about the performance we're gonna get. I just thought it was a little bit unfair to keep it running with my ultra low settings 1 GB of VRAM profile. Admittedly, it does double your frame rate still on a 980 Ti, But here, well, you've not really got anything to worry about. We are getting exceptionally good performance, so when it comes to actual gaming, yeah, you are looking at a pretty solid experience just out of the box. Well, not really out of the box, I did have to tweak this a little bit. If you got one with an actual decent cooler, I'd imagine this is pretty much on par with the performance you'd see out of the box though. So yeah, 980 Ti, it's already going pretty good and we've only just clicked play on a title. So I'm happy with that. Now, some people that watch this channel may never have heard of the 980 Ti. I'm sure a lot of us have, given its great reputation, but given how it's been overshadowed by the GTX 1080 and the 1080 Ti in recent years, some people have forgotten that this card, well, it was sort of one of the best high-end cards that I personally believe Nvidia's ever really come out with. It cost around £600 or $650 on launch, and what you ended up with was a card that could do 4K gaming. It was pretty much cut down from the full Titan X and offered you pretty much all of the performance, but for around £400 or around $500, yes, depending on where you were looking. And you've got to remember, when it comes to shifting graphics cards, the narrative hasn't really changed. Lots of people look up who has the most powerful card on the market, and will work their way down from there. So when Nvidia's offering the Titan X as the most powerful card, AMD's nowhere to be seen yet with their Fury cards, which, as we know, are quite big fans of on this channel, well, it was pretty much a no-brainer. If you wanted top-end performance at a somewhat decent price, at least compared to things today, the 980 Ti was the option. It was also an absolute king in the era of DirectX 11, and that was the primary API of the time, so pretty much although the AMD cards like the R9 Fury would come into their own as years went on release, it was all about the 980 Ti. Of course, people weren't exactly quick to replace these cards, because why would you? Maxwell deals with DirectX 12 pretty well, admittedly not as good as the AMD cards of the era, but still pretty decently, especially compared to Kepler that came before it, and it's only up until this point now in the market where all the focus is on the value of the GTX 1080 and the GTX 1080 Ti on the used market that people are forgetting. The 980 Ti came very close to these. Despite being a bit older, Maxwell has quite a few similarities with Pascal, and you can get a decent chunk of performance out of these for now, as we're seeing, bargain bin territory prices. So yeah, the 980 Ti, legendary card that offered Titan X performance, it went on to the stage where people just weren't getting rid of them, and finally, 11 years later, those of us shopping in this really low-end part of the market are now able to look at this legendary flagship as a cheap and viable option. So if I'm making all of this fuss about the 980 Ti, just why am I so excited to be testing it today? Well, given that we paid around £45 for the unit, just look at these specifications. It comes in based on the GM200 architecture, which was Maxwell 2, which was 28nm. You get a still fairly sizable 6GB of GDDR5 VRAM, running through, compared to today's cards, an enormous 384-bit memory bus. Drivers are still available from Nvidia, which is something that you can't really say for the competing AMD cards of the era, which have been years since they last saw any updates, and you get an insanely high 2,816 pixel shaders, 96 ROPs, 176 TMUs, and of course it was released 11 years ago now in 2015. Power consumption is a 250 watt TDP. Don't worry, I have a full section on trying to make it more efficient and the real facts and figures of how much power it'll use. But yes, it very much is a flagship card, and really, well, this blower cooler doesn't look like it should be adequate enough, but it does work and it does keep the card cold. So you can pick one of these up today anywhere from £35 to £75. The £35 ones are going to be these cheaper blower coolers that are often untested, and the £75 ones, well, that's just when you're going over to CEX, clicking buy it now on the website, and getting a 5-year warranty, which, you never know, with these older flagships could be worth it. Now, one point I do think it is important to stress is that a lot of these flagships that people are getting rid of, chances are they will be like the one that I've bought. Someone bought it, they got their use out of it, and now it's only now they found it and think, you know what, I don't need it, I'm getting rid of it, that you will end up with it. Unless it's been owned by an enthusiast, it will likely have never been cleaned and will be running old thermal paste. To give you an idea of just how much this affects our card in its current setup, we went from 4,779 while thermal throttling, up to a much more standard 5,000
6105. I did then overclock the card, but a lot of the gains that I got here are the blower coolers are very power limited, so simply by increasing a slider for the power and thermal limit in MSI Afterburner nets you a lot of the increase we see here, up to around 6257, which of course, if you're not buying a blower cooler, you'll probably be seeing a figure much closer to that straight out of the box. When it comes to performance across 3D Mark's various benchmarks, Cloudgate, of course, it's going to do well here. This is a DirectX 10 test, and we saw over 120,000. Firestrike was just under 20,000, which is a very good score and shows that for DirectX 11 titles, yeah, this thing is as good as it sounds. Time Spy's doing okay at 6,257, Steel Nomad Lite slightly beneath this, and more surprisingly, even for an 11-year-old flagship in the Steel Nomad, the full test, the one that's meant to be Are You Ready for the Future, we did return 1,378. Which is not a bad score for a card this old. But the thing people will want to know is how does the 980 Ti compare to other cards? And I was right with my line of thinking earlier when I said its real competition is Vega 56 because it finds itself between the RTX 3050 and Vega 56, which is not a bad place to be in for a card you can pick up for 40 quid. So what you're looking at is sort of RTX 3050 levels of performance, but more power consumption, and of course you don't get things like DLSS or ray tracing, which, now DLSS, you might hate the new version, but you can't deny it does work very well to eke out some extra performance. You still get FSR, which these cards respond very well to, better than the competing AMD cards of the era, but yeah, what you're looking at, somewhere between a 3050 and a Vega 56. At this point though, we have got everything out of the way. We've got our 980 Ti, we've made sure it's worked, we've gone through and cleaned it, we've got it all set up, and we know it's all working. So it is nearly time to get around to benchmarking this thing. So what we're going to be doing today is running through the standard benchmark suite, which is a mixture of newer titles and some of the most popular titles out there on Steam, because let's be honest, if you're someone looking at buying the 980 Ti, chances are you aren't fussed about the latest and greatest AAA titles, which I am trying to get a few downloaded, but one, my internet's terrible, and two, storage costs a fortune right now, and I've already filled up 2 terabytes with the current benchmark suite, but that's a rant for another day. So, yes, the 980 Ti is really going to be pushed to its limits here in a mixture of popular and new titles. And that's pretty much all I've got to say. So, if you're someone that's looking at a 980 Ti, you're seeing the value, you're seeing the scores, but you want to know just how does it perform, well, it's time to find out now in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, which we ran with the very high preset in a 1440p resolution. The 1440p resolution was purely because the game just runs too well in 1080p to actually get a result that's actually putting any real strain on the card. We returned 74 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 61 FPS, so you were pretty much guaranteed the game would be always in and around either the 60 FPS mark, but usually upwards of 70 FPS when not much was going on. So, yeah, even with the latest release of GTA 5, the old 980 Ti is still proving its flagship status by running the game with absolutely no problems. If you move over onto the world of online, because it's always a popular test to do, we see that things run even better. It makes sense, GTA Online in the Enhanced Edition is relatively well optimized, at least compared to the older Legacy release, and does tend to run better than single player does, purely because there's less going on, returning us averages of 78 FPS and 1% lows down to 63 FPS, so GTA 5 Enhanced Edition isn't really a problem here. I'm always a tad reluctant to test the Legacy release, but given its popularity and how many people love seeing it, we are going to be testing it today. And it's also quite relevant because, you'll remember, GTA 5 came out on PC when this graphics card was the best thing you could buy, pretty much. So we ran the game with ultra settings plus Nvidia PCSS shadows in a 1440p resolution, and returned 87 FPS on average, and 1% lows down to 64 FPS. Not really a surprise because, as I just said, this was the graphics card to have if you wanted to max out this game with all of the extra options enabled, so even today it's not really a problem. What is more interesting though is GTA Online Legacy, which has become a bit of a bloated mess over the years, and performance is definitely a bit detrimental even on the flagships of its era. With the same settings, we now drop to a 54 FPS average, with 1% lows down to 41 FPS, which shouldn't really be a surprise because it's nothing to do with the card, it's nothing to do with the drivers, It's purely down to the netcode of the game when you're over 16 players, because if you look at our utilization in the top left, you'll see that it's going all over the place. So still a playable experience, but really you are better off playing online with the Enhanced Edition. Moving on to a very popular title with Arc Raiders, and I will be honest, this is my first time seeing the game with high settings, purely because most of the graphics cards we've been testing recently, well, they struggle to run this even in very low resolutions with very low settings. But here, well, we achieved high settings with TAA enabled in a 1080p resolution and returned 64 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 51 FPS. So this is with no forms of upscaling, no Intel XeSS, no FSR, nothing of the sort like that. This is just the game running, well, in its native 1080p resolution, delivering a 60 FPS experience. Honestly though, I did do a little bit of dabbling around with FSR, and you could achieve a slightly higher average and a more stable frame time if you were to enable it, but honestly, you don't really need to because we're already seeing a consistent 60 FPS with the higher settings and a native resolution, so it's up to you. If you like FSR and bits and pieces like that, it has got a good implementation here, and it will help you achieve a slightly higher average, but genuinely, you don't really need to bother even on an old 980 Ti. But if there was something that's going to be a challenge, on the other side of the Unreal Engine spectrum we do have titles like Oblivion Remastered, and it is one of those games I need to get better at tweaking around with, but with the game's stock settings menu, we ran the game with medium options enabled, low texture enabled, in a 1080p resolution with FSR set to balance mode. You gotta remember this is a very VRAM intensive game, and one that has sporadic performance. I never know how it's going to perform. But still, with these settings we did return 41 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 34 FPS, which honestly is better than I thought we were going to do with just 6GB of VRAM. It is a bit of a bottleneck here because I don't doubt that some of the stutters in places were to do with that. If you are someone that doesn't like running the game with FSR though, you can actually lower the native resolution down to 900p, and you will take a slight dent to your average down to 36 FPS, with 1% lows down to 29 FPS, which was still a very playable and very enjoyable experience. I am sorry, for some reason my capture card absolutely hates this game. I am getting a new one, so as much as it does look a tad probably blurrier on screen, well, it actually did look slightly better to my eyes. So yes, you can still run it in a native resolution, but it's not going to be 1080p if you want to have any of the actual settings enabled. When it comes to esports titles, Counter-Strike 2 is arguably one of the most popular ones out there and a very good game to benchmark. With low settings plus dynamic shadows, which apparently is the current way that people are playing this game, we did utilise a 1080p resolution as well. We returned 264 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 187 FPS during the built-in benchmark. However, actual gameplay was liable to be slightly lower than this. During a deathmatch match? During a game of deathmatch on Nuke, which is arguably more intensive than this benchmark is for both the map and actually what's going on, we did see the game hover anywhere from sort of around 180 to 230 FPS instead, which is still very competitive and very playable, but it's worth noting that you will see some performance hit in certain maps. You've got to keep in mind this is an older card, but still, at the end of the day, you're always pretty much going to be seeing over 150 FPS on this card, so for a cheap card to get into Counter-Strike 2, it's actually not a terrible idea. Now, we already did get a brief glimpse at Cyberpunk, but given how intensive it's got and how many updates it's had, it's always a good benchmark to revisit on these older cards. So how is the 980 Ti dealing with it? Well, with the game running with its high presets, nothing changed around at all, just setting the game to how it thinks it should run with high settings, we returned a very playable 36 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 31 FPS. It's worth noting that these figures are of course taken when there's lots going on, there's heavy combat and bits and pieces like that, and it was very smooth and very playable. I had no problems with it whatsoever, so if you're prioritizing visuals, well, you can achieve a very playable and very smooth frame rate as long as you don't mind in and around 30 FPS. If you did want to aim closer to 60 FPS though, for some reason Maxwell deals with FSR, especially these good implementations like Cyberpunk has, way better than its AMD equivalent cards of the era, which is sort of ironic because it's prolonging the longevity of these types of Maxwell cards. So enabling FSR to its balance mode looks great, runs great, and pretty much doubles our average up to 61 FPS, with 1% lows down to 53 FPS. So Cyberpunk 2077, honestly, I'd say run with FSR here, purely because Maxwell deals with it so well. Next up we have PUBG, and I went into this not knowing anything about how it would perform on a Maxwell Flagship, because I've now had the chance to test one. With the game with the settings that most people are apparently playing this with, which is high options and low textures, because apparently that does something with the shadows and makes things more visible, I don't really know, it's been a while since I've actually played PUBG properly. We ran this with DirectX 11.1, which really does benefit these Maxwell cards, and returned possibly the best frame rate I have ever actually seen in PUBG. With 147 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 128 FPS, PUBG was pretty much not a problem here. So it got me thinking, if it runs this well with these competitive settings, I suppose people are calling them, how does it run the game with ultra settings? And would you believe it? Absolutely fine with 76 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 61 FPS. Honestly, I was someone that bought the R9 Fury for PUBG back in the day, and to be fair, it did run well, and with DirectX 12 it prolonged the longevity there as well, but if you're still running with the DirectX 11 mode, well, these Maxwell flagships are delivering over 100 FPS with competitive settings in a game that is notoriously unoptimized. If there is one game though that will run notoriously well on Nvidia cards and pretty much be completely unplayable on most things AMD, it is Baldurs Gate 3, and that rhymed far better than I thought it would. With high settings and DirectX 11 rather than Vulkan because it doesn't work too well, in a 1080p resolution we return 61 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 52 FPS. And I cannot explain to all of you how nice it is to be able to actually see Baldurs Gate 3 and play it with it feeling smooth. A lot of the time when we're testing this, we're testing lower VRAM cards or AMD cards that just can't deal with this game. Meanwhile here on the old and cheap 980 Ti, it is a perfect experience. So I have to give Nvidia credit here. I mean, is it Nvidia's fault that it doesn't run well on AMD? I'm not too sure who to blame, but at the same time, you do get an excellent experience and one that is quite rare to see on this channel. Next up we have Fortnite, which defaulted to high settings and DirectX 11. Makes sense, it's a Maxwell card, it can run DirectX 12, but really it does prefer running things in DirectX 11. And with these high settings we return 78 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 62 FPS. And this was taken from around 15 to 20 minutes of actual gameplay, where for some reason I was actually surviving and actually doing somewhat okay in this round, which I'm not going to say is to do with the 980 Ti. Probably having a decent graphics card for once probably did help, but it's taken from a good chunk of actual gameplay. So Fortnite, very controllable, very smooth. I actually played well, I mean probably not well, but somewhat decently while using the graphics card, so no problems here whatsoever. Fortnite runs perfectly. Next up we have BeamNG, which defaulted to ultra settings in DirectX 11. Well, didn't default to DirectX 11, it just makes more sense to use it here rather than Vulkan. And what was our performance like? Well, when benchmarking the jungle map, which is one of the more intensive scenarios you can find yourself in, we returned 55 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 50 FPS, so remarkably stable frame times, and a very good average that hovered just beneath 60 FPS, which is pretty much downright admirable, to be honest, given how intensive this game is. In certain scenarios, you could encroach on the VRAM limit, which would result in a tiny bit of slowdown, most if you flung yourself into a load of trees, but honestly, wasn't too much of a problem during actual gameplay when you're just enjoying playing BeamNG, so you can enjoy great visuals, and if you wanted to achieve constantly over 60 FPS, just drop the game down to high or very high, and it will likely run perfectly fine. So the 980 Ti and BeamNG, really not a problem. Now, Mount & Blade Bannerlord we have seen struggle on some Nvidia cards. Even some of the lower-end Maxwell cards, which are of course very similar architecture to this, have struggled. But here on the 980 Ti, maybe it's just brute force power, but it really wasn't a problem. With ultra settings in 1080p during the built-in battle benchmark, which is very reminiscent of the late game, we returned 88 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 61 FPS. During actual gameplay, for a lot of the early to mid-game, this would be well over 100 FPS, so honestly, for Mount & Blade Bannerlord, all I'd do, ultra settings, cap it at 60 FPS, you're looking at a great experience from the early, mid and late game, with no problems whatsoever. It's also worth noting the battle size does scale with the settings used, so of course this is pretty much a worst case scenario for the type of gameplay you'll ever be seeing. So Mount & Blade Bannerlord, no problems, no worries, and you can enjoy it perfectly fine on the 980 Ti. It's always a popular request to have Rust tested given how intensive it's got over the years. I can remember a few people actually buying 980 Ti's to play this back in the early days, but of course that was considered overkill. But still, it is a very popular title and is always in the top played games on Steam, so with high settings and the textures set to half size, which really did help maintain a more playable frame rate, we returned 58 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 51 FPS. This was taken from around 10 minutes of me bumbling about and just trying to play Rust. It's not one of those games I'm very familiar with, so of course I just bumble about and try and get myself into situations that seem intensive, and it worked perfectly fine. Honestly, if you dropped it back to medium, I'd imagine you'd see a constantly locked 60 FPS given there was no problems with utilization, so Rust perfectly fine even in 2026. A lot of people are very quick to write off these Nvidia cards, saying they can't run DirectX 12 very well and they will struggle in those newer titles. But as we've already seen from the few DirectX 12 titles we've tested, it seems to deal with it absolutely fine, and one of my favourite implementations of it is in Hitman, which tends to run really rather well when a card can utilise it properly. And here, with high settings and the game set to its best simulation speed, which of course is still intensive on the graphics card as well as it is on the processor, we returned 88 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 72 FPS. It's well worth keeping in mind that this benchmark map is the newer one and is usually more intensive than actual gameplay is, so I'd imagine during actual gameplay you could probably turn a few things up to Ultra if you really wanted, but honestly I wasn't expecting this level of performance out of Hitman because I've heard so many people say to me, oh, this one's it's really brutal on those older Nvidia cards, and here we are testing an 11-year-old Nvidia Flagship, and yeah, it runs fine. I've got no criticisms, and for the price I paid for this card, the visuals are pretty good as well. Now, the last time I remember seeing anyone benchmark Fallout 4 on a 980 Ti was before the anniversary update, and I do have to say that with the 6GB of VRAM, which may have seemed overkill 11 years ago, well, it does come into its own here because now Fallout 4 runs perfectly on a 980 Ti with the anniversary update. Ultra settings in 1080p, and we returned 60 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 59 FPS. Utilization can be all over the place given this is still Fallout 4 and utilization is always over the place in Fallout 4, but it was nice to see that this runs perfectly with no frame time problems, no issues, just runs really well. So Fallout 4, the 980 Ti was one of the better options out there when you started playing it on launch, and the anniversary update, which arguably is more intensive, does actually return a smoother experience, which was nice to see. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? Well, no, not out of the box. See, the game calls on a Vulkan DLL file that the game will just not launch with. I'm guessing it's not provided through the Maxwell drivers and it just refuses to run and just crashes. However, after a bit of snooping around and looking actually at what it was crashing with, I figured, why don't we just provide the Vulkan DLL to the drivers and the game and see if it launches? And would you believe? Yeah, it does actually launch on a 980 Ti. There's so many people doing write-ups saying it doesn't run on Maxwell, but I'm fairly sure we have seen it run on Maxwell before, if I'm not forgetting things. So here we are, Crysis Remastered 980 Ti with the high preset in 1080p, and we returned 63 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 54 FPS. This figure is of course taken from the actual section we do benchmark, but given this is Crysis Remastered, I have to constantly replay the beginning section every time I want to test it, but it looked great, it ran great, and honestly, no problems whatsoever with it here. So Crysis Remastered, I'm very happy with that. So, overall performance of the 980 Ti in the benchmarks. And there's a couple of ways I want to look at this. Number one, this is an 11-year-old flagship that is still kicking and still doing really rather well. And number two, from a value proposition, this is a cheap graphics card. This is something you can commonly grab for under £50. Yes, it might be one of the lower end versions like we've got here, but you can still do some tweaking and a bit of cleaning and get this level of performance out of them, which is exceptionally solid. And I'm probably going to make a point here that some people may be upset by, but as much as these cards are on the very minimal support you get from Nvidia, it does mean you get bug fixes, and you do get some optimizations, not major ones, but you can pretty much guarantee most games will work, and will work fine. That isn't everything though. I will say I did have issues with Red Dead Redemption, where it just wouldn't work. It's something I've ran into in certain Nvidia cards. You have to roll back the driver version and you can make it work, but come on Nvidia, I mean, let's be honest, these are great cards, but they work on the equivalent AMD cards, and it's the one thing that doesn't here. Red Dead Redemption 2 on Maxwell just doesn't seem to be ever happy for me. But when it comes to other titles, Oblivion Remastered, which is Unreal Engine 5 at its very worst, is still playable. You've got Counter-Strike 2, more than competitive enough to the stage where I think my processor was more of a limit. Cyberpunk looks and runs great. Pretty much all of the popular titles out there on Steam run fantastically, and this is the first time I have got to see Crysis Remastered running at high settings. And I'm seeing it on an 11-year-old flagship. One of the most popular titles that people constantly ask me to benchmark, Arc Raiders. It's always popular on Steam, people love seeing it, and it's so well optimized that even here on a 980 Ti, high settings plus anti-aliasing, no upscaling at all, solid 60 FPS. The 980 Ti is old, but honestly, the performance is still excellent and still very reminiscent of the flagship it once was. And I was going to finish this little bit here because usually I don't shower the cards with this much praise, but honestly I've been waiting to test one of these for years. AMD has inadvertently extended the lifespan of the 980 Ti by how well it runs on Maxwell. So many of their earlier GCN cards you end up with a laggier experience or bad frame times or the VRAM getting filled up. Here on a 980 Ti, you turn on FSR, it usually looks pretty good, and it runs great as well. So AMD has inadvertently helped these older flagships return even better performance than their own cards of the era are getting. Now I do just briefly want to say that yes, a lot of the Nvidia features do work through the Nvidia app. Personally, I'd roll back the drivers and keep the older overlay, but as we've seen on our previous tests of the 750 Ti and the GTX 745, that does work and does work really well. So for today, I wanted to actually just use the standard experience. I've gone on the website, I've downloaded the Nvidia drivers, I've installed the Nvidia app, and does it work? Well, yeah, it all seems to work fine. It'll go through, it'll optimize your games, and I know for a lot of people that isn't something you're really interested in, but if you are looking at building a computer for someone, I do have to give Nvidia credit. Being able to actually just get settings that will usually work from the drivers makes a lot more sense to someone that's not familiar with computers. They can just click on their drivers, click optimize, launch the game, and they will usually get the experience they're happy with. They can either drag the slider up for better looks or down for higher frame rate. Things like that do still work. The Nvidia overlay still works, which is useful if you want to get some more performance metrics without having to download MSI Afterburner or rely on the Steam overlay, and you can still access Nvidia Shadowplay. Now, the Nvidia NVENC on these cards is nothing to write home about. I do believe it was later versions of Pascal that got the upgraded NVENC encoder, meaning the one here is passable, it works okay. I believe it's slightly worse than the AMD cards it was up against, especially at lower bit rates, but at the same time, it works through the drivers, it works through OBS, you can stream with it, and you can record with it. When you're buying a cheap graphics card like this, things like this and extra perks are just bonuses, so it's just something I want to touch on. The drivers do work, it's nice to actually be receiving driver updates, which is something you don't get from certain manufacturers, and all the features I tried did seem to run. But of course, when it comes to running these older flagships, you do still have to deal with the fact that this very literally is a flagship card and has the requirements for it. Even with this blower cooler, thermals were controllable, but we did still see the card top out at 91 degrees, which is where it is when it's thermally throttling, during a Furmark stress test. This also resulted in the clocks lowering to keep the card where it should be, but this isn't something you have to worry about in gaming. That only happens with Furmark, which is a power virus. When it comes to gaming, we saw 84 degrees, and other than this, the card ran perfectly fine. It's worth noting the blower cooler is not particularly loud, so you could achieve better thermals than this if you manually set a fan curve that was a lot more harsh. So the card keeps itself cool enough to be usable, but can be a little bit hot in places. At the same time, when it comes to power consumption, this is a major point. It may be a cheap card, but power supplies, there's a few good bargains to be had out there, but they aren't cheap units. So you have to keep in mind that under peak burst usage, we saw 278 watts out of this. When this throttles down, it'll stabilize around 256 watts, makes sense, the 250 watt TDP is there for a reason, and our gaming average was just south of 240 watts. I have included a section there though for power and clock limited, because oh yes, we're doing it. How efficient is the Maxwell architecture? Well, I tried to scale things back as much as possible to try and balance the clock speed and the power load on the card to just see how efficient we could make it. At the end of the day, there's only so much wiggle room you have here, especially with the Nvidia drivers, which don't allow a phenomenal amount of voltage control, but I brought this down to just sub 150 watts. With this, we were still able to play through GTA 5 Enhanced Edition on ultra settings and still achieved a very decent frame rate, and of course, when you want to compare this to actual cards, we see that we're in and around Intel Arc's Meteor Lake levels of performance and slightly below a GTX 1060 when it's running at a 140 watt TDP. So yeah, it's in and around a 1060, but of course, Maxwell was never designed for this level of efficiency, at least when it's not scaled up this big. So it's nice to see that you could run it on a lower end power supply. I'm just going to say maybe not worth it. We got around 60 to 70% of the full performance at half the power consumption, but of course this was liable to change depending on how intensive what you were doing was. So there we have it, the GeForce GTX 980 Ti. And as much as people call the 1080 and the 1080 Ti the legendary cards, for me, well, the 980 Ti's entered that next stage that the 1080 hasn't. Bargain bin territory. And the 1080, I'm not arguing its value, I'd like to get one to test on the channel, but you can't argue that we are getting exceptionally good performance out of its predecessor, and you can pick them up for next to nothing. I can't really argue with anything we've ran into. Yes, dealing with Vulkan was a bit of a problem in Crysis Remastered, but dropping a couple of DLL files into a couple of things to run the game at high settings, not exactly the end of the world, is it? So, you know what? I'm going to say this is probably my go-to budget card at the moment. With the RX 580 and the GTX 1060 costing a similar amount of money, either go for one of these or stretch to Vega 56, because they're both going to return a great, they're going to return a great experience. But I would say that this is probably the better option. I mean, yes, you are missing out on the power efficiency and the thermals, which is a big appeal of those lower tier cards, but come on. This thing is selling for the same price and offering you an extra 30 to 50% extra performance, which in some games is the difference between playable or unplayable. So yes, I hope you've all enjoyed the 980 Ti. I hope you can tell, and you can probably definitely tell I've been excited to review this one because I wanted one of these for years, so I'm glad I finally got the chance to. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. This video has been a lot of work with lots of data in it. They always are when it's one of these more fancy cards. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to really say about it. I suppose I could tell you this is one of the minimum flagships you require for running Bazite because it is Maxwell, so it does have some degree of support on Linux. It's not fantastic, it's better than Kepler, but it's nothing like Turing and those that go forward from there, so worth keeping that in mind. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and good night.